text, TIES Center. Professional Learning Group Series. Building Inclusive Education Systems for All Students. Session 5. Sustaining a Culture of Openness and Inquiry. Amy Howley, Ed.D., and Deborah Telfer, Ph.D.
This webinar is the last in a series about what it takes for districts to be effective in their practice of inclusive instructional and organizational leadership. I'm Deborah Telfer, Director of the University of Cincinnati's Systems Development and Improvement Center, SDI Center for short. Our center is one of the partners in the TIES project, the National Technical Assistance Center on Inclusive Practices and Policies. In this webinar, we will discuss the importance of sustaining a culture of openness and inquiry in your district.
Next slide text, general statement of the strategy. Liberty scales and stick figures with a common speech bubble overhead, in connected circles, holding hands with arms raised, and standing behind an arrow pointing up.
Although it's much easier said than done, districts need to shape their organizational cultures in ways that make those cultures collaborative, caring, ethical, equitable, and amenable to positive change. Of course, culture in general is resistant to change. That's why the work of shaping a district's organizational culture requires commitment, flexibility, and patience.
Next slide text, turn and talk number 1. Take a few minutes to think about and discuss the following.
Now might be a good time to stop the video for a turn and talk. Over the next few minutes, think about your answers to the questions on the slide. Then talk about your answers with a partner. The questions are: 1. What is meant by positive change? 2. What are some earmarks of an organizational culture that is collaborative? 3. What do you think is meant by equitable in terms of organizational culture? 4. What does it mean to be caring as an organization?
Next slide text, debriefing turn and talk number 1. 2 men high five.
The discussion you had in response to the turn and talk questions may have given you a sense of the complexity of the work involved in making district cultures more collaborative, caring, and equitable. It also may have helped you see that positive change is about more than achievement gains. There are, for instance, ways to promote achievement gains that introduce negative changes into a district culture. The point of improvement work is to introduce positive changes in the ways people treat one another that give everyone the room to work hard and improve what they do. It turns out that openness and inquiry are the keys to this kind of change.
Next slide text, 5 steps to sustaining a culture of openness and inquiry.
Also, as it turns out, 5 steps lead to and help maintain a district culture of openness and inquiry. The slide lists all 5. Reviewing them all together at this point in the webinar illustrates the character as well as the challenging nature of the work of cultural change. The remainder of the webinar focuses on specific actions for moving forward with each step. Here are the 5 steps. First, build a collaborative culture that values the contributions of all members, however diverse. Then, extend care to all individuals and groups that interact with the district and its schools. Next, develop, maintain, and enforce high standards of ethical conduct. Fourth, establish and implement rules and norms promoting inclusion, equity, and social justice. Finally, and continually, welcome opportunities to improve by engaging in self-reflection and critique, accepting criticism from external sources, and basing improvement strategies on evidence from both internal and external sources of current strengths and weaknesses.
Next slide text, Step 1. Build a collaborative culture that values the contributions of all members, however diverse. Stick figures with a common speech bubble overhead.
What does it mean to work in a collaborative culture? Collaboration brings together diverse perspectives and talents in service of a common goal. Members of the culture need to feel safe enough to share ideas, and they need to believe that other members of the culture will value their ideas. At the same time, they need to want to listen to, and in some cases, act on the ideas of other members. Organizations foster a collaborative culture by establishing non-negotiables relating to collaboration, providing opportunities for everyone to share, affirming everyone's contributions, and celebrating group accomplishments.
Next slide text, the value of multiple, diverse voices. Valuing multiple voices leads to empowerment, effective teamwork, increased collective efficacy. People stack their hand together.
All these practices are difficult in part because they run counter to the individualistic norms of our larger culture. But the payoffs of using these practices are significant. For example, when organizations value the different perspectives their members bring to the table, all members of the culture see that their input makes a difference. This experience makes them feel empowered. When they then see their ideas combined with those of others to produce an even better idea, they experience the benefits of teamwork. Then, when the team is given the chance to put its ideas into practice, the team builds collective efficacy. A common saying, one you've probably heard, sums up the value of collaboration. The smartest person in the room is the room.
Next slide text, missing voices. 4 stick figures hold hands. They all have a question mark on their torso. A speech bubble shows a mute symbol.
But whose voices do we forget to include? Who is missing from the district's leadership teams? Whose feedback do we ignore? Investigating missing voices can show us the boundaries that limit our collaboration and inclusiveness. Then we can begin work to break down those boundaries. Looking for missing voices is one way to start thinking about breaking down boundaries and increasing inclusiveness. Developing a diversity statement is another.
Next slide text, turn and talk number 2.
To consider diversity statements in a bit more depth, stop the video briefly for another turn and talk. What is a diversity statement? It's a written commitment to efforts designed to break down boundaries that limit collaboration and inclusiveness. To be effective, a diversity statement should focus attention on actual boundaries to collaboration and inclusiveness about which the district is aware. Here are 2 examples. The Anyplace School District commits to ensuring that all students, including those with the most significant cognitive disabilities, receive their education in their neighborhood schools. The Everywhere School District commits to efforts to elicit and respond to feedback from all families in the district, including families from traditionally marginalized groups. Take 10 minutes to talk to 1 or 2 others in your group about district boundaries that limit collaboration and inclusiveness. Then draft a district-specific diversity statement. Spend a few minutes sharing the diversity statement that each small group developed. Were the statements similar or different? Why do you think they were similar or different?
Next slide text, step 2. Extend care to all individuals and groups that interact with the district and its schools. Stick figures in connected circles.
Let's consider the second step in the process for establishing a culture of openness and inquiry. It involves practices that extend care to all individuals and groups that interact with the district and its schools. Extending care requires more than just having an open-door policy. District and school leaders extend care when they presume the competence of the individuals and groups with whom they speak, and when they advocate for the well-being of those individuals and groups.
Next slide text, deeper dive, implicit bias. A woman pushes someone in a wheelchair down a sidewalk.
Presuming competence sounds easy, but it actually isn't. We all have beliefs that get in the way. A collective term for these beliefs is implicit bias. Implicit biases are something we all have. They are our unexamined assumptions about the merits of other people and groups, their competence and moral character, as well as the goodness and badness of their appearance, behaviors, beliefs, and values. We develop our implicit biases early in childhood, but we rarely bring them to the surface. Nevertheless, they control how we think and act, they shape our expectations of others, and they are hard to get rid of.
Next slide text, countering implicit biases. A raised fist covered with words like transcend, liberate, empower, and transform.
The process of getting rid of implicit biases starts by bringing them to the surface. Owning our erroneous and negative beliefs about other people and groups is the first step to dispelling them. Then we can begin the process of informing ourselves with facts about these individuals and groups, and getting to know people whom we previously ignored or avoided, and developing empathy for those whom we previously dismissed or denigrated.
Next slide text. Step 3. Liberty Scales.
There's a lot more to say about implicit bias, but the webinar needs to move forward to consider Step 3 in the process of establishing and sustaining a culture of collaboration and inquiry. Step 3 involves work to develop, maintain, and enforce high standards of ethical conduct. These standards should reflect the needs and concerns of the students, parents, guardians, community members, and personnel in the district. Obviously, they should also reflect federal and state laws and policies, as well as the standards set by relevant professional associations. Most importantly, however, codes of conduct answer the question, what do we owe other people?
Next slide text. Deeper dive. High bar ethics. A man leaps over a high jump bar.
What is the difference between compliance with a code of conduct and following a moral compass? First, compliance with a code of conduct means following rules set out by an external source. These rules often come from outside the district and relate to the district only in the sense that all districts, including each particular district, must comply. Second, compliance with the code of conduct is mandatory. One does not have a choice. Therefore, a person's motivation for compliance with a code of conduct is extrinsic. Finally, non-compliance with the code of conduct leads to punishment. That's another source of extrinsic motivation. High bar ethical standards, by contrast, motivate us because we see them as the right way to act. They match our locally developed vision of our best selves. That is, they matter in our local context, and they are motivated by intrinsic concerns and desires rather than by mandates. Taken together, codes of conduct and high bar ethics lead us to do our best for every person or group with whom we interact.
Next slide text. Turn and talk number 3. Doing the right thing.
Perhaps stop the video once again, this time to discuss codes of conduct and high bar ethics. Use the following questions to guide your discussion with a partner or small group of colleagues. What rules in your districts or states or professional associations' code of conduct support high bar ethical principles to which most district personnel subscribe? What rules, if any, in your districts or states or professional associations' code of conduct push district personnel to expect more of themselves or to do the right thing more often than they otherwise might? What rules, if any, in your districts or states or professional associations' code of conduct restrain district personnel from acting in the best interests of others?
Next slide text. Step 4. Stick figures hold hands with arms raised.
This step actually builds on internal and external codes of conduct and locally generated diversity statements to synthesize the actions district personnel should take in order to promote inclusion, equity, and social justice. Like non-negotiables governing collaborative work, these non-negotiables translate what we value as a district into how we must act. The slide includes some examples. Personnel employed by the district must interrupt any use of derogatory language in communications among children, among staff, between staff and children, and between staff and community members. Assignment of students to classrooms should reflect proportional representation. One-on-one support from a paraprofessional is a temporary measure to help a student acclimate to an inclusive educational environment. The IEP must address how this type of support will be faded over a reasonable period of time.
Next slide text. Step 5. Welcome opportunities to improve. Stick figures stand behind an arrow pointing up.
Interestingly, a district's non-negotiables relating to collaboration and inclusiveness connect directly to its ability to benefit from inquiry processes. If we are unable to collaborate with others, we can't learn from them. If our implicit biases cause us to hold low expectations of others, we will have little motive to improve our own performance. That's because we'll attribute low performance to the unchangeable limitations of others, such as students and families, rather than to practices that we have the power to change.
Next slide text, Step 5, continued.
In addition to these types of non-negotiables, the intentional use of self-reflection and critical friend practices help districts benefit from the inquiry processes they put in place. Self-reflection focuses on some key questions that apply to all employees and leadership teams. What worked and for whom? What didn't work and for whom? And why? These questions lead to the fundamental improvement question: what can I or we do better next time? Self-reflection, especially in groups, helps build openness to critique from others, what might be called critical friend feedback. None of us likes to hear criticism, but if we are open to hearing it, we can learn a lot. In fact, openness to this type of feedback allows us to learn from a variety of sources: students, community members, colleagues, and supervisors. And most importantly, learning from these sources can give us insights about how to improve, steps in our journey toward becoming our best selves.
Next slide text, improvement is work we do on ourselves.
Improvement is ultimately work we do on ourselves as individuals and as teams. Inquiry processes provide fuel for that work. Commitments to inclusion, equity, and social justice provide motive, but the power behind improvement is always our own commitment to the students, families, and the communities we serve. Districts can help by treating feedback as an opportunity to learn and grow. A gotcha mentality is the quickest way to close down other people's learning. Helping them feel safe enough to learn and grow is a comparatively slower and more complicated process, but well worth the time and effort.
Next slide text, summary.
To summarize the ideas in this webinar, this slide repeats the 5 actions that help bring about and maintain a culture of openness and inquiry. First, building a collaborative culture that values the contributions of all members, however diverse. Second, actively extending care to all individuals and groups that interact with the district and its schools. Next, developing, maintaining, and enforcing high standards of ethical conduct. Fourth, establishing and implementing rules and norms promoting inclusion, equity, and social justice. Finally, welcoming opportunities to improve by engaging in self-reflection and critique. Thank you for your interest in these important leadership practices. Helping everyone in the district develop and maintain a culture of openness and inquiry is a critical link in the chain of practices leading to improved district-wide performance and increased district-wide equity.
Next slide text, TIES Center is supported through a cooperative agreement, number H326Y170004, with the Research to Practice Division, Office of Special Education Programs, U.S. Department of Education. Project Officer, Susan Weigert. Opinions expressed herein do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of the U.S. Department of Education. The National Center on Educational Outcomes, NCEO, leads the TIES Center partnership. There are 6 additional collaborating partners: Arizona Department of Education, CAST, University of Cincinnati, University of Kentucky, University of North Carolina Charlotte, and University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Students sit in a classroom.